When basketball legend Michael Jordan's luxury SUV breaks down on a rainy Chicago afternoon, fate leads him to a modest auto repair shop, run by an elderly mechanic who doesn't seem to recognize him. As the two men talk while waiting out the storm, Michael realizes this unassuming repairman is none other than Mr. Wilson, the driver's education teacher who taught him the fundamentals of the road decades ago at Laney High School. What begins as a chance encounter becomes a profound reunion, revealing how the lessons of a forgotten mentor shaped the mindset of greatness. Michael Jordan tapped his fingers on the steering wheel as raindrops raced down his windshield. The wipers swept back and forth, fighting against the steady autumn shower. He was driving his black Range Rover through the outskirts of Chicago, having just visited his old neighborhood, where the Bulls had first made him feel at home nearly 40 years ago. Still looks the same, he muttered to himself, a small smile playing on his lips. At 60 years old, Michael's face had changed. More lines around his eyes, a touch of gray in his close-cropped hair. But his 6'6" frame still commanded attention wherever he went. Today, he wore a simple navy sweater and jeans, trying to blend in as much as someone of his fame could. He was in town for a special Bulls event tomorrow night. The team was honoring him and several former teammates at the United Center. These events always brought back a flood of memories. The championships, the struggles, the brotherhood of those teams. Michael turned up the radio as an old song came on. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof of his SUV. The streets were emptier out here, away from downtown. Just small shops, gas stations, and houses with yellowing lawns preparing for winter. That's when he heard it. A strange clicking sound from somewhere under the hood. Then, a whining noise that grew louder. What the? Michael frowned, leaning forward slightly, as if that would help him hear better. A warning light flashed on the dashboard. The steering suddenly felt heavy in his hands. The car began to slow, even though his foot was still on the gas pedal. "Come on, not now," he muttered, scanning the roadside for a place to pull over. Up ahead, he spotted an old gas station with a small garage attached. The sign, partially obscured by the rain, read, "Wilson's Auto Repair." Michael guided his struggling vehicle toward it, the engine now making alarming sounds. He managed to pull into the lot just as the car gave one final shudder and died completely. He sat for a moment, rain pounding on the roof, and pulled out his phone. No signal. "Perfect," he sighed, slipping the useless phone back into his pocket. Michael popped the hood, then stepped out into the rain. It immediately soaked into his sweater as he walked to the front of the car. Steam rose from the engine, mixing with the cool rain. He didn't know much about cars. He could change a tire if needed, but anything under the hood was beyond him. That's what happened when you had people taking care of such things for most of your adult life? He looked toward the garage. A light was on inside, and he could see movement. Someone was there, at least. Michael closed the hood and jogged toward the building, raindrops sliding down his face. The garage door was open, revealing a workshop that looked like it hadn't changed much since the 1970s. Tools hung in neat rows on the walls. An old radio played soft jazz from a shelf cluttered with parts. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and grease, but swept clean. In the middle of it all stood an elderly man bent over the engine of an old Chevy. All Michael could see was his back, slightly stooped, dressed in worn blue coveralls. A white head of hair caught the fluorescent light from above. "Excuse me," Michael called out. "My car broke down outside. Wondering if you could help me out." The old man didn't look up immediately. His age-spotted hands continued working, turning a wrench with careful precision. They shook slightly with the effort, but moved with the confidence of someone who had done this same task thousands of times. "Be with you in a moment," came the reply, voice gravelly but strong. Michael stepped further into the garage, out of the rain. He rubbed his arms, suddenly aware of how wet and cold he was. The garage smelled of oil, rubber, and something else. Maybe coffee brewing somewhere in the back. Looking around, Michael noticed a small office to the side. Through its window, he could see a desk covered with papers and walls lined with photos and what looked like newspaper clippings. A basketball trophy sat on a shelf, tarnished with age. The old man finally straightened up with a small groan. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt and turned around. He was probably in his 80s, with a face weathered by time. Deep wrinkles mapped his forehead and the corners of his eyes. But those eyes themselves were sharp. A clear, bright blue that seemed to take in everything about Michael in one glance. What surprised Michael most was that there was no flash of recognition in those eyes. Usually, even people who tried to play it cool couldn't help that initial widening of the eyes, that subtle shift in posture when they realized who he was. "What seems to be the trouble?" the old man asked simply, as if Michael were any other customer who had wandered in on this. "Rainy afternoon. Car died on me just outside," Michael explained, gesturing toward the lot. "Warning light came on. Then strange noises. Then nothing." The man nodded, reaching for a rain jacket hanging on a hook by the door. "Let's take a look then. I'm Henry." "Wilson!" He held out his hand. "Michael Jordan," Michael replied, shaking the offered hand. Henry's grip was firm despite his age, his palm calloused from decades of manual work. Still no recognition. Either Henry Wilson had been living under a rock for the past 40 years, or he was the best actor Michael had ever met. "Well, Mr. Jordan, let's see what's wrong with your vehicle," Henry said, zipping up his jacket. He grabbed a flashlight from a workbench and limped slightly toward the door, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who refused to be hurried by age or weather. As they walked back into the rain, Michael found himself studying the old mechanic. There was something familiar about him, though Michael couldn't place it. Something in the way he carried himself, perhaps. It reminded him of his own father. That same quiet dignity, that same unimpressed attitude toward the world. For the first time that day, Michael felt the weight of nostalgia, not just for his basketball days, but for something deeper. A time when he wasn't Michael Jordan the legend, but just a kid trying to find his way, guided by men like his father who valued hard work above all else. The rain continued to fall as they approached his stranded SUV, neither man rushing despite the weather. Some problems, Michael thought, couldn't be solved by hurrying. The rain continued to fall as they approached his stranded SUV, neither man rushing despite the weather. Some problems, Michael thought, couldn't be solved by hurrying. Henry circled the Range Rover once, his eyes taking in the vehicle with a professional gaze. "Nice car," he said simply, without the tone of awe most people used when commenting on Michael's possessions. "It's reliable." "Usually," Michael replied, feeling oddly defensive. Henry nodded and gestured for Michael to pop the hood. As the latch released with a click, Henry lifted the heavy hood with surprising strength for a man his age. He propped it open and bent over the engine compartment, flashlight in hand. "When did the warning light come on?" Henry asked, his voice slightly muffled. "About a mile back. Then it made clicking sounds, then whining, then just died." Henry hummed to himself, moving the flashlight methodically across the engine components. His hands, though spotted with age and slightly trembling, moved with certainty. "Your alternators. Gone bad," he said after a few minutes of inspection. "Batteries drained too, as a result." Michael shifted his weight, rain dripping from his nose. "Can you fix it?" "I can." Henry straightened up. "But I'll need to order the part. Won't come until tomorrow morning at the earliest." Michael checked his watch. He had a dinner with Bulls executives in 3 hours. "Is there a rental place nearby? Or can you call me a cab?" Henry shook his head. "Nothing out here. I could give you a ride somewhere if you need, though." "That would be great," Michael said, relieved. "I appreciate it." They walked back to the garage, both men hunched against the rain. Inside, Michael watched as Henry called his parts supplier, arranging for the alternator to be delivered first thing tomorrow. There was something calming about the old man's efficiency, his lack of wasted words or movements. "You got a card for the tow company?" Michael asked, reaching for his wallet. "I can have them pick it up." "No need for that," Henry interrupted. "Car's already here. I can work on it tomorrow when the part comes in." Michael nodded. Most people would be falling over themselves to help him, making a big show of it. Henry's matter-of-fact attitude was refreshing. "So," Henry said, hanging up the phone, "what brings you to this part of town? Not many folks your age come through here unless they're lost." Michael smiled at that. "Just visiting my old neighborhood. I used to live in Chicago, here for an event." "With the Bulls?" "The basketball team?" Henry asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Michael stared at him. Was it possible this man truly didn't know who he was? "Yeah, the basketball team. Always liked basketball," Henry said, limping over to a small coffee maker in the corner of his office. "Been a Bulls fan since the 70s. You follow them?" Michael couldn't help but laugh. "You could say that." Henry glanced at him, one eyebrow raised as he poured coffee into 2 mugs. "Something funny about that?" "No, sir," Michael said, the "sir" slipping out automatically, the way it did when he was talking to someone who reminded him of his father. "I played for them, actually, for a while." Henry handed him a chipped mug of steaming coffee. "Is that right? Professional player?" "Well, with your height, I suppose that makes sense." He gestured to an old wooden chair. "Have a seat. No use standing around getting those fancy clothes any wetter." Michael sat, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "You really don't recognize me?" Henry settled into his own chair behind the cluttered desk, taking a sip of coffee before answering. "Should I?" Part of Michael wanted to explain, to say his full name again, to mention the championships and the shoes and everything else. But another part, a part that rarely got to breathe these days, enjoyed the anonymity. Enjoyed being treated like a regular person with car trouble. "No," Michael said finally. "I guess not. It was a long time ago." Henry nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Time passes. The world moves on. You played in the 90s, I'm guessing?" "Started in '84, actually." "Ah," Henry said. "I was already an old man by then. Stopped following as closely once Jordan came along. Everyone got so excited about him. Tickets got expensive. Started just listening on the radio instead." Michael nearly choked on his coffee. "You didn't like Jordan?" Henry shrugged. "Seemed like a fine player. But basketball changed, became more about one person than the team. At least that's how it looked to me." Michael set down his mug, a strange feeling settling in his chest. For decades, people had told him how great he was, how he changed the game for the better. But here was this old man, unimpressed, unknowingly criticizing him to his face. And oddly enough, Michael wasn't offended. There was something honest about Henry's assessment, something that cut through the decades of myth-making. "Anyway," Henry said, checking his watch, "where can I drop you? I'm guessing you need to get to that Bulls event." "Anyway," Henry said, checking his watch, "where can I drop you? I'm guessing you need to get to that Bulls event." Michael checked his own watch. I've got a dinner downtown at 7 down, but it's only 4:30 now. He looked at his stranded SUV through the window, rain still streaming down its black paint. Mind if I hang around while you close up shop? I could help, if you want. Henry seemed surprised by the offer. You want to help? In those clothes? Michael glanced down at his now damp designer sweater and shrugged. It'll dry. Henry studied him for a moment, then nodded. Could use a hand. Actually, I was working on Mrs. Diaz's Chevy before you came in. Just doing some basic maintenance, but these old hands aren't as quick as they used to be. Lead the way, Michael said, rolling up his sleeves. They moved to the old Chevy, its hood still open. Henry handed Michael a flashlight. Hold this steady for me, would you? Michael did as asked, directing the beam where Henry pointed. For the next 20 minutes, they worked in comfortable silence, broken only by Henry's occasional request for a different tool or for Michael to adjust the light. You know much about cars? Henry finally asked, tightening a bolt with careful precision. Not really, Michael admitted. My dad used to work on our old Ford when I was a kid. I'd help sometimes, holding the light just like this. But once He paused, catching himself. Once I started making decent money, I always just took my cars to the dealer. Henry grunted. Dealers charge triple for what I do, but I suppose if you've got the money, it's convenient. My father would agree with you, Michael said with a smile. He believed in doing things yourself whenever possible, fixing your own problems. Sound like a smart man, Henry replied, reaching for a rag to wipe his hands. You close with your dad? Was, Michael said, the familiar ache returning whenever he spoke about his father. He passed away in '93. Henry's movements paused briefly. Sorry to hear that. Lost my Martha in 2010. Doesn't get easier, just different. Michael nodded, knowing exactly what the old mechanic meant. The shared understanding of loss hung between them for a moment. The rain drummed harder on the metal roof, filling the silence. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm's getting worse, Henry observed, moving back to his work. So what's this Bulls event about? Season starting soon? It's a recognition ceremony, Michael explained, careful not to say too much. Honoring some former players. Anyone I might have heard of? Henry asked, his hands working steadily. Michael couldn't help but smile. Magic Johnson will be there. Scottie Pippen. Dennis Rodman. Now those are names I know, Henry said with a nod. Good team, those '90s Bulls. Even I have to admit that. What about Jordan? Michael couldn't resist asking. You mentioned him before, Henry chuckled. Well, can't talk about those teams without mentioning him, can you? Greatest player of all time, they say. He reached for a wrench. Hand me that socket set, would you? Michael passed him the tools, noting how Henry had neither agreed nor disagreed with the greatest assessment. You don't sound convinced. Oh, he was great, no question, Henry said, his focus on the engine. But greatest? I saw Wilt Chamberlain play, saw Oscar Robertson. Different eras, different games. He glanced at Michael. You're too young to remember. Them, I suppose. I've seen footage, Michael said, suddenly enjoying this unusual conversation more than he had enjoyed talking basketball in years. No one ever argued with him about his place in history anymore, at least not to his face. Footage isn't the same, Henry insisted. You had to be there, feel the energy in the building. His eyes took on a distant look. Took my son to see the Bulls in '72. Tickets were $12. Now you can't get in the door for less than $100. Times change, Michael said. Some things shouldn't, Henry replied, closing the hood of Mrs. Diaz's Chevy with a solid thunk. He wiped his hands again and looked at Michael. "Thanks for the help. You're pretty good with that flashlight." "Had a good teacher," Michael said, thinking of his father. Henry walked over to check on the rain, which was coming down in sheets now. "Won't be letting up anytime soon." He looked at his watch. "Still early for your dinner? Want some more coffee?" Michael nodded, surprised at how relaxed he felt in this old garage with this old man who had no idea who he really was. It was like stepping out of a costume he'd worn for decades, one that had grown so familiar he'd forgotten it wasn't his skin. They moved back to Henry's small office. Michael noticed more details this time. The basketball trophy was from Laney High School, dated 1978. A photo showed a younger Henry with a basketball team, his arm around a tall, skinny kid with a bright smile. "You coached?" Michael asked, pointing to the picture. Henry followed his gaze. "Part-time. Taught driver's ed, too, and some shop classes. The garage was always my main business, though." "You taught a lot of kids," Michael observed. "Tried to teach them more than just basketball or driving or fixing cars," Henry said, pouring fresh coffee into their mugs. "Tried to teach them about life, about working hard and doing things right." The words struck a chord with Michael. He'd heard similar sentiments from his own father, from his coaches, the kind of old-school wisdom that had shaped him, pushed him. "Those are good lessons," Michael said softly. "Don't know if kids today want to hear them," Henry replied, sitting heavily in his chair, the day's work clearly weighing on his aging body. "Everything's instant now. Fast food, fast fame." Michael sipped his coffee, thinking about his own children, their lives so different from his growing up. Some lessons still matter, though. Some things don't change. Henry raised his mug slightly, a gesture of agreement. "To the things that shouldn't change." Outside, the storm continued, keeping the world at bay for just a little while longer. Henry raised his mug slightly, a gesture of agreement. "To the things that shouldn't change." Outside, the storm continued, keeping the world at bay for just a little while longer. Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see several missed calls and texts from his assistant, wondering where he was and if he was still making the dinner. "Need to make a call," Michael said, standing up. "My assistant's probably worried." Henry nodded and busied himself with some paperwork, giving Michael privacy. Michael stepped into the main garage area and called his assistant, Jeff. "Michael, where are you? Everyone's been trying to reach you for the past hour." Jeff's voice was tight with worry. "My car broke down," Michael explained. "I'm at a garage on the outskirts of town. I'll need a driver to pick me up for the dinner." "I'll send someone right away. What's the address?" Michael looked around for a moment, then asked Henry, who provided the information. "The driver should be there in about 45 minutes, Jeff said after checking. "Traffic's bad because of the storm." "That works. Thanks, Jeff." Michael ended the call and returned to the office. "Your ride coming?" Henry asked, looking up from his paperwork. "In about 45 minutes, Michael confirmed, sitting back down. He looked around the small office again, studying the photos and memorabilia more carefully. On one wall hung an old Bulls pennant from the 1970s, faded but carefully preserved. Next to it was a collection of photos showing Henry with different high school basketball teams over the years. In one corner sat a small bookshelf filled with repair manuals, basketball coaching books, and what looked like photo albums. "Been a Bulls fan a long time," Michael observed, gesturing to the pennant. "Since '66, Henry confirmed. "Saw their first game at the International Amphitheater. Wasn't much of a show back then." Michael smiled. "Long way from those days." "Everything changes," Henry said. Doesn't mean it all changes for the better. A framed newspaper clipping caught Michael's eye. It showed a much younger Henry standing next to a classic car with a trophy. The headline read, "Local teacher wins regional auto show." "You were a teacher?" Michael asked, though Henry had already mentioned teaching driver's education. Henry followed his gaze to the clipping. For 30 years, taught auto shop, drivers, ed, and coached basketball at Laney High in North Carolina before moving to Chicago. Michael felt his heart skip a beat. Laney High? In Wilmington? Henry nodded. That's right. You know the area? Before Michael could answer, the phone on Henry's desk rang. The old man answered it, speaking briefly to someone about a repair job scheduled for tomorrow. Michael used the moment to study the office more carefully. His eyes landed on a class photo hanging near the door. It showed rows of teenagers standing in front of a line of old cars, with Henry and another teacher standing at the ends. The label at the bottom read, Laney High Driver's Education, Spring 1978. Michael moved closer, scanning the young faces, and there, in the back row because of his height, stood a skinny teenager with a serious expression, himself at 15 years old. His breath caught in his throat. Could it really be? Had fate somehow brought him to the shop of his own drivers? Education teacher from all those years ago? Henry hung up the phone. Sorry about that. Customer worried about her car. He noticed Michael studying the photo. One of my driver's ed classes back in Wilmington. Michael turned to face Henry, really looking at him now, trying to see past the wrinkles, the white hair, the stooped posture to the younger man he might have known briefly, almost 50 years ago. Mr. Wilson, Michael said slowly, I think I was in your driver's ed class. At Laney High, Henry squinted at him, tilting his head slightly. Were you now? Can't say I recall every student, he smiled gently. Taught hundreds over the years. Michael wasn't offended. Why would Henry remember him? He hadn't been Michael Jordan then, just Michael, a growing boy who loved basketball more than anything. It was 1978, Michael said. Spring. Semester. Henry's eyes drifted back to the photo. That's so. Small world. He didn't seem particularly impressed by the coincidence. You were a good driver back then? Michael laughed. Not at first. But you were strict about doing things right, following the rules. Still am, Henry said with a small smile. Rules exist for a reason. Thunder cracked outside, making both men glance toward the window. The rain showed no signs of letting up. My family moved to Chicago in '82, Henry said, easing himself back into his chair. Martha got a job at the university. Opened this shop a year later. Been here ever since. And you still follow the Bulls, Michael noted. Hard not to in Chicago, Henry replied, but I don't get to games much anymore. Ticket prices, parking, crowds, easier to watch on TV, when I bother to watch at all. You don't watch much basketball now? Michael asked. Henry shrugged. Game's different. Too much showboating. Not enough fundamentals. He gave Michael a pointed look. You played, you said. When was that? Michael hesitated. Through the 90s, mostly. Jordan era, Henry said with a nod. Those were good teams. Michael couldn't help but smile. Yes, they were. An old clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Michael found himself wondering what would happen if he told Henry who he really was. Would the old man be impressed, embarrassed about his earlier comments? Or would he just nod and continue treating Michael exactly the same way? Somehow, Michael suspected the latter. There was something refreshingly solid about Henry Wilson, something unchangeable. a man who had taught generations of young people and treated them all the same, with firm expectations and simple respect. "You said you have kids?" Henry asked, breaking the silence. Michael nodded. "5. 3 boys, 2 girls." "Good drivers," Michael laughed. "I made sure of it. Remembered your lessons when I taught them." Henry smiled at that, a genuine smile that lit up his weathered face. That's the thing about teaching. You never know what sticks, what gets passed down. He gestured to the photo. "Most of those kids probably don't remember my name, but maybe something I taught them helped keep them safe on the road. That's enough." Michael thought about all the coaches he'd had over the years, how their voices still echoed in his head sometimes during difficult moments, how he'd passed their wisdom on to his own children, often word for word. "Teachers matter more than they know," Michael said quietly. Henry nodded, his eyes distant. "Hope so. That's what kept me going all those years." The phone on Michael's lap buzzed. A text from the driver. He was 10 minutes away. "My ride's almost here," Michael said, feeling oddly reluctant to leave. "Better get you back to your fancy dinner," Henry said, standing up with a small groan. "Bull's executives won't want to wait on account of an old mechanic." "Let me pay you for the diagnostic," Michael insisted, reaching for his wallet. "And for the ride you were going to give me." Henry waved him off. "We'll settle up when your car's fixed. No charge for the company. Been a while since I had someone to talk to who didn't need their oil changed." Michael smiled, oddly touched. "I appreciate that, but I insist on paying properly for the repairs tomorrow." "We'll see," Henry said noncommittally, leading the way back to the main garage area. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the worst of the storm having passed. They stood in the open garage door, watching the wet street beyond. In the distance, headlights approached. Michael's ride. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Michael said formally, extending his hand. Henry shook it firmly. "Call me Henry. And it was good meeting you, Michael. Your ride back to the fancy part of town is here." As the black Lincoln Town car pulled up, Michael had the strange feeling that he was leaving something important behind in this old garage. Something he hadn't even realized he'd been missing. As the black Lincoln Town car pulled up, Michael had the strange feeling that he was leaving something important behind in this old garage. Something he hadn't even realized he'd been missing. "What time should I come back tomorrow for my car?" Michael asked, lingering in the doorway. "Part will be here by 9, Henry replied. "Should have it fixed by noon, barring any surprises." "I'll be here at noon then," Michael said, then added impulsively, "Why don't you come to the Bulls event tomorrow night? I can get you a ticket." Henry looked surprised. "Me? At a fancy Bulls ceremony?" He glanced down at his oil-stained coveralls. "Don't think I'd fit in with that crowd." "You'd be my guest," Michael insisted. "Consider it a thank you for the help today." Henry seemed about to refuse, but then nodded slowly. "All right then. Been a while since I've been to the United Center." "Great," Michael smiled, genuinely pleased. "I'll bring the ticket tomorrow when I pick up my car." The town car honked lightly. The driver, a young man in a black suit, was standing by the passenger door now, holding an umbrella. "Mr. Jordan," the driver called, "we should get going if you want to make your dinner." Michael saw the change in Henry's expression immediately. The slight widening of the eyes, the small step backward, the recognition finally dawning. "Jordan?" Henry repeated, looking at Michael more carefully now. "Michael Jordan? That Michael Jordan?" Michael nodded, feeling oddly apologetic. "Yes, sir." Henry shook his head slowly. "Well, I'll be damned." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Thought you looked familiar, but I figured it was just from my driver's ed class." You really didn't recognize me? Michael asked, still not entirely believing it. Eyes aren't what they used to be, Henry admitted. And I wasn't expecting Michael Jordan to walk into my shop on a rainy Tuesday. He chuckled softly. All those things I said about you and the Bulls were honest, Michael finished for him. That's what made them valuable. The driver was looking impatient now, checking his watch. Go on to your dinner, Henry said, making a shooing motion with his hands. Don't keep those executives waiting. Michael nodded and walked to the car. As the driver held the door, he turned. Back to Henry. Tomorrow at noon, and the offer for the ticket still stands. I'll be here, Henry promised, standing in the garage doorway, a small figure against the warm light behind him. Michael settled into the back seat, and the driver quickly rounded the car to get behind the wheel. Everything all right, Mr. Jordan? The young man asked, glancing at Michael in the rearview mirror. Yes, Michael said, watching the garage recede as they pulled away. Everything's fine. The driver seemed eager to make conversation with his famous passenger. Car trouble, huh? Good thing the old man was still open. Looks like he's been there forever. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, Michael said, thinking about Henry's careful, methodical approach to his work. If you say so, sir, the driver replied, clearly not convinced. We've got you a brand new Range Rover being delivered to your hotel for use while you're in town. Should be there by the time we get back from dinner. Thank you, Michael said, though he found himself not really caring about the replacement vehicle. His mind was still back at Wilson's auto repair, piecing together the strange coincidence that had brought him there. The drive to downtown Chicago took nearly an hour in the rainy evening traffic. Michael used the time to call his assistant again, confirming details for tomorrow's schedule and mentioning that he'd need to step out around noon to pick up his car. As they neared the restaurant, bright lights and sleek buildings replacing the modest neighborhoods they'd driven through, Michael's thoughts remained on Henry, on the strange twist of fate that had brought his old driving instructor back into his life after nearly 50 years. The car pulled up to the restaurant, where several men in suits were waiting under the awning. Michael recognized the Bulls owner and several executives. They smiled and waved as they spotted his car. We were getting worried, Michael, called Jerry Reinsdorf, the Bulls chairman. Thought you might have forgotten us. Car trouble, Michael explained as he emerged from the town car. But I met an interesting mechanic. The men laughed, patting him on the back as they moved into the restaurant. Only you would find something positive about a broken-down car, Michael, one of them joked. Inside, the maitre d' immediately whisked them to a private dining room in the back. As Michael settled into the luxurious surroundings, he couldn't help but think about the stark contrast with Henry's modest garage. Both places had their own kind of comfort, their own kind of authenticity. Throughout dinner, as the executives discussed plans for tomorrow's ceremony and reminisced about the glory days of the 90s Bulls, Michael found his mind drifting. He kept seeing Henry's weathered hands working on that engine, kept hearing his unfiltered opinions about the changes in basketball. You seem distracted tonight, Michael, observed Scottie Pippen, who had joined them midway through the meal. Everything okay? Just thinking, Michael replied, taking a sip of water. Do you remember your driver's ed teacher, Scottie? Pippen looked surprised by the question. Can't say that I do. Why? I ran into mine today, by complete chance. And that's got you this thoughtful? Scottie laughed. Must have been some teacher. He was, Michael said simply. Then, changing the subject, so what time do we need to be at the United Center tomorrow? As the conversation moved on to logistics for the ceremony, Michael made a mental note to call his foundation in the morning. Perhaps it was time to establish a scholarship or program for automotive education. Something that would honor teachers like Henry Wilson, who shaped young lives in ways that often went unrecognized. When dessert arrived, Michael declined, checking his watch. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, it's been a long day. I think I'll head back to the hotel." There were protests, but they were good-natured. Everyone understood that Michael Jordan set his own schedule. Outside, as another town car pulled up to take him back to his hotel, Michael looked up at the clearing night sky. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and clean. Stars were just becoming visible between the remaining clouds. Tomorrow he would return to Wilson's Auto Repair. Tomorrow he would see if his old teacher remembered anything more about the Ryu, lanky teenager who had once nervously sat behind the wheel under his instruction. Tomorrow might bring answers to questions Michael hadn't even known he wanted to ask. Tomorrow might bring answers to questions Michael hadn't even known he wanted to ask. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed away the haze that often hung over Chicago. Michael woke early in his hotel suite, his mind already on the day ahead. He had a busy schedule: interviews with local media, a photo shoot for the Bulls' social media, lunch with former teammates. But at the center of it all was his noon appointment at Wilson's Auto Repair. As he sipped his coffee on the balcony overlooking the city, Michael found himself wondering about Henry Wilson. Had he recognized Michael immediately yesterday and simply played along? Or had he truly not realized who his customer was until the driver arrived? Either way, the old mechanic had treated Michael differently than most people did. No special treatment, no fawning, no carefully measured words. Just straightforward conversation and honest opinions. After finishing his coffee, Michael made a call to the director of his charitable foundation. "Janet, I need you to look into something for me," he said after exchanging pleasantries. "I want to establish a program for automotive education, scholarships, equipment for schools, that sort of thing." "That's a new direction for us," Janet replied, her voice curious. "Any particular reason?" "I met someone who reminded me how important good teachers are," Michael explained. "Not just in traditional subjects, but in practical skills too. Skills that give kids options in life." "I'll start researching options," Janet promised. "We could possibly partner with technical colleges or high school programs." "Perfect," Michael said. "And Janet, I want this to be substantial, not just a one-time donation." After hanging up, Michael felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't often anymore that he felt genuinely inspired to start something new. Most of his charitable work, while important, had become routine. The morning passed quickly. Michael answered the same questions he'd been answering for years about his career, his businesses, his memories of playing in Chicago. He posed for photos with his former teammates, laughed at old stories, signed basketballs for charity auctions. But through it all, his mind kept drifting back to Wilson's Auto Repair, to that class photo from 1978, to the teenager he had been and the man who had taught him. At 11:45, Michael slipped away from the United Center, telling his team he'd be back in an hour. His driver seemed confused when Michael gave him the address. "Same place as yesterday, sir?" "For your car?" the young man asked. "That's right," Michael confirmed. "Henry said it would be ready by noon." The driver shrugged and pulled into traffic. Michael settled back in his seat, watching the city transform around them as they drove from the gleaming downtown area to the more modest outskirts where Henry's shop stood. When they pulled up to Wilson's Auto Repair, Michael felt an unexpected sense of homecoming. The small garage looked exactly the same in the daylight as it had in yesterday's storm. A little worn around the edges, but solid and reliable. "Wait here," Michael instructed the driver. "I shouldn't be long." The garage door was open, and Michael could see his Range Rover parked inside, looking freshly washed. Henry was wiping his hands on a rag as he walked out of his office. "Right. On time," the old mechanic called out when he spotted Michael. "Just finished her up about 20 minutes ago." "Looks like new," Michael observed, walking into the garage. "I appreciate the wash." "Comes with the service," Henry said with a small shrug. "Want to take her for a quick spin? Make sure everything feels right?" Michael nodded. "Good idea." Henry handed him the keys, their fingers briefly touching. Michael was struck again by how weathered the old man's hands were. Hands that had taught countless students, repaired countless vehicles, shaped countless lives in ways both small and profound. They climbed into the SUV together, Henry settling into the passenger seat with a small groan. "Knees aren't what they used to be," he explained. Michael adjusted the seat and mirrors, then pulled out of the garage. It felt strange to be driving with Henry beside him, a reversal of their roles. From long ago. "Take a left here," Henry directed as they reached the street. "There's a good stretch of road where you can get her up to speed. Make sure the alternator's charging properly." Michael followed the directions, acutely aware of Henry watching his driving technique. "Am I passing your inspection, Mr. Wilson?" he asked with a smile. Henry chuckled. "Old habits die hard, I suppose. Once a driving instructor, always a driving instructor." He gestured to the dashboard. "All your gauges reading normal?" "Everything looks perfect," Michael confirmed. They drove in silence for a few moments before Henry spoke again. "I remembered more about you last night," he said. "After you left. Couldn't sleep much, so I dug through some old boxes. Found my teaching records from Laney High." Michael's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "And? You were in my spring class. Of 78, all right. Tall, skinny kid. Quiet in class, focused. Good reflexes." Henry paused. "Already obsessed with basketball, as I recall." Michael smiled at the description. "That was me." "Your father came with you to the first class," Henry continued. "James, wasn't it? Serious man. Wanted to make sure you were going to take it seriously." "You remember my father?" Michael asked, surprised. Henry nodded. "Some parents you don't forget. He wasn't pushy or demanding like some, just solid. Expected the best from you. Reminded me of my own father." Michael felt a tightness in his throat. Few people talked about his father this way anymore, as a real person they had known, not just as Michael Jordan's father or a tragic news story. "He was the best man I've ever known," Michael said quietly. "I could tell he was raising you right," Henry replied. "Turn here, back toward the shop." As Michael made the turn, he found himself wanting to know more. "Did you follow my career after I left Laney?" Henry shifted in his seat. "Heard about you making varsity, of course, then winning the state championship. When you went to North Carolina, I'd catch games when I could." He paused. "By the time you came to Chicago, I was here, too. Watched a lot of Bulls games in the 80s and 90s. But you said you stopped following as closely when Jordan came along," Michael reminded him, curious about the apparent contradiction. Henry gave a small, embarrassed cough. "Might have stretched the truth there. Truth is, I never could afford tickets once you made the Bulls popular. Watched every game I could on TV, though." "You knew who I was yesterday," Michael realized. "From the beginning." "Not at first," Henry insisted. "Your face has changed, and these old eyes aren't what they used to be. But when you mentioned playing for the Bulls, well, it started clicking then." "Why pretend?" Michael asked as they pulled back into the garage. Henry waited until Michael had parked and turned off the engine before answering. "Figured you get enough people treating you like a celebrity. Thought you might appreciate someone just treating you like a regular person with car trouble." He shrugged. "Plus, Wasn't sure you'd remember a driver's ed teacher from all those years ago." Michael sat back in his seat, studying the old man beside him. "I didn't remember you specifically," he admitted, "but I remembered the lessons. About focus, about preparation, about seeing what's ahead instead of just reacting." Henry's eyes crinkled with a smile. "That right? Well, good to know something stuck." He opened his door. "Car's running fine. Let's get you back to your busy day." As they climbed out, Michael reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Your ticket for tonight. 7 o'clock at the United Center. I'll leave your name at the VIP entrance." Henry took the envelope carefully. "Don't know about the VIP part, but I'll be there. Thank you. And what do I owe you for the car?" Michael asked, reaching for his wallet. Henry handed him a neatly written invoice. The total was modest, far less than Michael would have paid at a dealership. "This can't be right," Michael said, looking at the figure. "That's my rate," Henry said firmly. "Same for everyone. Don't need your charity, Mr. Jordan." Michael understood immediately. Henry's pride wouldn't allow him to give the service for free, but neither would he inflate the price for a wealthy customer. Same for everyone. A principle the old teacher lived by. "Fair enough," Michael said, writing a check for the exact amount. As he handed it over, he added, "I'll see you tonight then." "Looking forward to it," Henry replied, tucking the check into his pocket without looking at it. "Drive safely now." As Michael walked back to his waiting town car, he turned for one last look at the garage. Henry stood in the doorway, a straight-backed figure despite his age, watching him go. Something had shifted between them today, a connection drawn more clearly, a past acknowledged. And yet, Michael felt there was still more to discover, still more to understand about the impact this unassuming teacher had made on his life. The answers, he hoped, would come tonight. The answers, he hoped, would come tonight. The afternoon passed. In a blur of media interviews and rehearsals for the evening ceremony, Michael smiled for cameras, shook hands with sponsors, and reminisced with old teammates. But through it all, his mind kept returning to Henry Wilson and their unexpected reunion. During a break, Michael pulled Scottie Pippen aside. "Remember that driver's ed teacher I mentioned?" Michael asked. Scottie nodded. "The one you ran into yesterday? What about him?" "I invited him tonight. He'll be at the VIP entrance." Scottie raised an eyebrow. "Must have made quite an impression on you." Michael shrugged, not wanting to explain fully. Sometimes the most important influences aren't the obvious ones. As the afternoon wound down, Michael returned to his hotel to change for the evening. He chose a simple but elegant dark suit. Not the flashiest in his collection, but well-tailored and classic. He wanted to look his best tonight, not just for the cameras and fans, but for his old teacher. On the way to the United Center, Michael found himself unusually nervous. Would Henry actually show up? Would he feel out of place among the celebrities and executives? Would their connection, rekindled so briefly, deepen or fade away? The venue was already filling with people when Michael arrived through a private entrance. Security personnel, event staff, and team officials buzzed around, making final preparations. Michael was immediately whisked away to a green room where other Bulls legends were gathering. "Hey, Mike," called Dennis Rodman, flamboyant as ever, in a bright purple suit. "Heard you got stranded in the boonies yesterday. Should have called me. I know all the best tow truck guys in Chicago." Michael smiled, accepting a glass of water from an attendant. "It worked out. Met an interesting person. You always did have." "The craziest luck," laughed Horace Grant, adjusting his signature goggles. "Only Michael Jordan would have a car breakdown turn into something positive." Michael chatted with his former teammates for a while, but his attention kept drifting to the door. At 6:45, he quietly slipped out, telling an assistant he needed some air before the ceremony. Instead of heading outside, Michael made his way to the VIP entrance. He wanted to be there when Henry arrived, to personally welcome him to this world so different from the modest garage where they had reconnected. Michael positioned himself slightly out of sight, watching as celebrities, business, executives, and former players arrived. Some he greeted with a nod, others with a quick handshake. But he remained focused on looking for one specific face. At 6:55, a taxi pulled up outside. Michael watched as Henry stepped out, looking uncomfortable but dignified in an old suit that had clearly been carefully pressed for the occasion. The old mechanic paid the driver, then stood for a moment, taking in the imposing facade of the United Center. Michael felt a sudden tightness in his chest, seeing Henry there, small, weathered, but standing straight despite his years, brought home the contrast between their lives. Between the path Michael had traveled and the one Henry had followed. Before Henry could approach the entrance, Michael stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson," he called, walking toward him. Henry turned, surprise, and then recognition crossing his face. "Michael, didn't expect you to be greeting guests yourself." "Not all guests," Michael said, extending his hand. "Just the special ones." Henry took the offered hand, his grip still firm despite his age. "Not sure I belong in this crowd." "You belong?" "More than most of them," Michael assured him. "Come on, I'll show you around before things get started." As they walked through the VIP entrance, Michael noticed heads turning. People recognized him, of course. They always did. But they also noticed the elderly man walking beside him, clearly not a celebrity or known figure in the basketball world. "Who's that with Jordan?" Michael overheard someone whisper. "Must be family," came the reply. "Or someone important." Michael placed a hand lightly on Henry's shoulder, steering him past the curious onlookers. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "They're always looking for some gossip." Henry nodded, taking in the gleaming corridors and memorabilia displays with wide eyes. "Place has changed since I was last here. Must have been 15 years ago, at least." Michael led him through a series of hallways until they reached a quiet area with a view of the court. The arena was filling with people, the energy building as game time approached. "Used to dream about playing in places like this," Henry said, unexpectedly. "Way back when I was young. Had some talent, but not nearly enough." He glanced at Michael. "Not like you." Michael looked at his old teacher with new curiosity. "You played?" "High school, small college in North Carolina. Nothing special." Henry smiled. "Found I was better at teaching than playing. More satisfaction in it, too." A staff member approached, informing Michael that the ceremony would begin in 20 minutes and he was needed backstage. Michael nodded, then turned to Henry. "I've arranged a seat for you in the front row," he said. "After the ceremony, there's a private reception. I'd like you to join us." Henry looked uncertain. "Don't want to impose on your special night." "You wouldn't be," Michael insisted. "Please come to the reception. There's something I'd like to announce, and I'd appreciate having you there." After a moment, Henry nodded. "All right, then." As Michael turned to leave, Henry called after him. "Michael, I brought something you might want to see. After the ceremony, perhaps?" Michael raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" "Some old records," Henry said vaguely, "from Laney High. Thought they might interest you." Before Michael could ask more, the staff member was tugging at his sleeve, insisting they needed to go. With a nod to Henry, Michael allowed himself to be led away. Throughout the ceremony, the speeches, the highlight videos, the standing ovations, Michael found his gaze returning to the front row where Henry sat. The old teacher watched everything with interest, applauding at appropriate moments, but never with the wild enthusiasm of the fans around him. Always measured, always dignified. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he approached the podium to thunderous applause. As the noise gradually subsided, he looked out over the crowd, his eyes finding Henry in the front row. And suddenly, Michael knew exactly what he wanted to say. Not just the usual thanks to fans, teammates, and coaches that everyone expected. Something more personal. Something about the unexpected teachers who shape our paths in ways we don't fully appreciate until years later. Henry Wilson was one of those teachers. And tonight, Michael would make sure the world knew it. Henry Wilson was one of those teachers. And tonight, Michael would make sure the world knew it. When people ask me about my success, Michael began, his voice echoing through the arena, they usually want to hear about my famous coaches, about Dean Smith at UNC, about Phil Jackson here with the Bulls. The crowd applauded at the mention of the legendary Bulls coach who sat nearby. Those men shaped me as a player, no doubt, Michael continued. But tonight, I want to talk about a different kind of teacher, the kind we sometimes forget to thank. Michael paused, his eyes finding Henry in the front row. Yesterday, my car broke down on the outskirts of Chicago. Pure chance led me to a small garage run by a man named Henry Wilson. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people wondered where this story was going. Mr. Wilson fixed my car. But as we talked, I discovered something amazing. 45 years ago, this same man taught me how to drive at Laney High School in Wilmington, North Carolina. Michael watched as heads turned toward Henry, who sat straight-backed but clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Mr. Wilson didn't just teach me to operate a vehicle. He taught me about focus, about seeing far down the road instead of just right in front of me, about handling the unexpected with calm and preparation. Michael smiled as memories came flooding back. I didn't realize until yesterday how many of those driving lessons applied to basketball, to business, to life. Sometimes the most important teachers are the ones whose lessons we carry without even knowing their source. The ceremony continued with more speeches and video tributes, but Michael had made his point. He had acknowledged a debt long unpaid, a connection nearly forgotten. After the formal ceremony ended, security guided Henry to the private reception area, where Michael greeted him warmly. "Didn't expect all that," Henry said, looking slightly embarrassed. "Wasn't necessary to mention me." "It was long overdue," Michael insisted, guiding Henry through the crowd of celebrities and executives. "You said you brought something to show." "Me?" Henry nodded, patting the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "After your speech, I'm not sure it matters now. You already remembered more than I expected." "I'd still like to see it," Michael said. They found a quiet corner away from the main crowd. Henry carefully removed an aged folded paper from his pocket. "After you left yesterday, I dug through my old teaching records," he explained, unfolding the paper with care. "Found this in a box I haven't opened in years." Michael took the offered document. It was a student driving log from 1978, yellowed with age, but still legible. On it, he recognized his own teenage signature next to various dates and driving exercises. "Turn it over," Henry prompted. Michael flipped the page. On the back was a section labeled Instructor Notes. In neat, precise handwriting, Henry had written, "Jordan shows exceptional focus and quick decision-making, unusually aware of his surroundings, anticipates rather than merely reacts. If he applies these same qualities to his basketball, he will go far." Michael stared at the words, written when he was just 15 years old. "You knew?" he asked quietly. Henry shrugged. Didn't know you'd become the Michael Jordan. But I knew you had something special. Saw it in how you handled yourself behind the wheel. He smiled slightly. Heard from the basketball coach that you had talent. Figured you'd play college ball at least. Michael carefully refolded the paper. I'd like to keep this, if you don't mind. Brought it for you, Henry replied. Thought you might want it. A server passed with champagne, and Michael took 2 glasses, handing one to Henry. To good teachers, he said, raising his glass. To students who listen, Henry countered, clinking his glass against Michael's. As they sipped their champagne, Michael studied the old man before him. There were still questions he wanted to ask, connections he needed to make. You moved to Chicago in the 80s, you said. Did you ever come to see me play? Henry nodded. A few times. Couldn't afford tickets often, especially once you made the team. So popular. He smiled. Watched every game I could on TV, though. You could have reached out, Michael said. I would have gotten you tickets. Didn't seem right, Henry replied. You were busy becoming a legend. Didn't need some old driving instructor coming around, claiming a connection. Michael understood. Henry's pride, his sense of propriety, wouldn't have allowed it. Yet you kept that driving log all these years. Kept records on all my students, Henry said. But yes, I followed your career more closely than most. Felt a bit of pride every time you succeeded. Wondered sometimes if any of those driving lessons had stuck. More than you know, Michael assured him. When I taught my own kids to drive, I heard your voice in my head. Look ahead, not just at what's right in front of you. Henry's eyes crinkled with pleasure. That right? Well, good to know I made some small difference. Not small, Michael corrected him. Remember what I said in my speech about the unexpected teachers? I meant it. Across the room, Michael noticed several of his former teammates watching them. Curiously, he gestured them over. Guys, I want you to meet Henry Wilson, my driving instructor from Laney High, and the man who fixed my car yesterday. Scottie Pippen was the first to extend his hand. So you're the mystery man Michael's been talking about? Nice to meet you, sir. Mr. Wilson taught me to focus on what's ahead, not just what's right in front of me, Michael explained. Sound familiar? Scottie laughed. That's exactly what you used to tell us during games. Always thought that was your own wisdom, Dennis Rodman added, shaking Henry's hand. Borrowed wisdom is still wisdom, Henry said with a modest smile. As his teammates chatted with Henry, Michael felt a sense of completion. Circles within circles, connecting his past with his present. The lessons he'd received becoming lessons. He passed on, both to his children and to his teammates. Later, as the reception wound down, Michael made his way back to Henry. My driver can take you home whenever you're ready. Been a memorable evening, Henry said. Thank you for including me. I have one more question, Michael said. What made you remember me? After all these years, all those students, what made my name stick? Henry considered this for a moment. Hard to say exactly. Something in how you carried yourself, even then. A determination in your eyes. He paused. And maybe because we talked about more than just driving. We did? Michael tried to remember. One day after class, you asked me if I thought you could make it to the NBA, if I thought you were good enough. Michael's eyes widened. What did you say? Henry smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. I told you what I tell all my students, with a dream. That talent matters, but preparation and focus matter more. That seeing the road ahead is what separates the good from the great. And suddenly, Michael remembered. A brief conversation after class, standing beside Henry's old car. A nervous teenager asking an adult he respected for an honest assessment of his chances. Words of wisdom that had become part of his personal philosophy without him even remembering their source. "I remember now," Michael said softly. "You told me that greatness isn't about what you can do when everything's perfect. It's about what you can do when things go wrong." Henry nodded, pleased. "You were listening, after all." "I remember now," Michael said softly. "You told me that greatness isn't about what you can do when everything's perfect. It's about what you can do when things go wrong." Henry nodded, pleased. "You were listening, after all." The reception continued around them, but Michael barely noticed the crowd. His mind was racing through memories, connecting moments from his past with the wisdom that had guided him through his career. "You know," Michael said thoughtfully, "during the '97 finals, I played with a terrible flu. Could barely stand before the game. Everyone told me to sit it out." Henry listened attentively. "But something pushed me to play anyway. To find a way, when everything was going wrong." Michael looked at Henry with new understanding. "I scored 38 points that night. They called it the flu game. One of my proudest moments wasn't about talent. It was about pushing through when things weren't perfect." "Saw that game on TV," Henry admitted. "Reminded me of something I used to tell my students. The road isn't always going to be clear and dry. Sometimes you have to drive through the storm." Michael smiled at the driving metaphor that so perfectly captured his basketball philosophy. "I used that exact line with my teammates once. Never realized where it came from." As the evening wound down, more guests approached to meet Henry, curious about this previously unknown influence in Michael Jordan's life. The old mechanic handled the attention with dignity, never claiming more importance than he deserved, but standing straight and speaking clearly when addressed. Near the end of the reception, Jerry Reinsdorf, the Bulls' owner, pulled Michael aside. "Your driver's ed teacher?" "Really?" he asked with gentle skepticism. "More than that," Michael replied firmly. "Sometimes the most important teachers aren't the ones with the biggest names or the most famous programs. They're the ones who say the right thing at the right moment, when your mind is open to hearing it." Reinsdorf nodded slowly. "Well, he seems like a fine man, and clearly made an impression on you." "I'm planning something for him," Michael said. "A program through my Foundation for Automotive Education. Scholarships for kids, support for teachers. Going to name it after him. He'll appreciate that, I'm sure." Michael watched Henry across the room, now chatting comfortably with Scottie Pippen. "It's not just for him. It's for all the Mr. Wilsons out there. The teachers whose names don't make headlines, but whose words stick with us." When it was finally time to leave, Michael's driver brought the car around to a private exit. Henry said his goodbyes to the players and executives he'd met, receiving each handshake and pat on the back with the same modest dignity he'd shown throughout the evening. "My driver will take you home," Michael insisted as they walked toward the exit. "And I'd like to stop by the garage again tomorrow, if that's all right. There's something I want to discuss with you." "Shop's always open," Henry replied. "For you, anyway." As they approached the exit, a small group of reporters who had lingered after the main press conference spotted them. "Mr. Jordan, can we get a picture with your special guest?" one called out. Michael looked at Henry, raising an eyebrow in question. The old mechanic shrugged, a silent, "Why not?" They paused, allowing a few photographs. One reporter stepped forward with a recorder. "Sir, how does it feel to be recognized by Michael Jordan as an important influence in his life?" Henry considered the question carefully before answering. "Surprising," he said finally. "I was just doing my job, teaching young people how to drive safely, how to see the road ahead. Never expected any recognition for it. Did you know back then that he would become the greatest basketball player of all time? Henry's eyes twinkled. Knew he had something special. Determination you don't see often, but the greatest of all time? He glanced at Michael with a small smile. That part he figured out on his own. After the brief impromptu press conference, Michael walked Henry to the waiting car. Sorry about that, Michael said. Reporters are always looking for a new angle. No harm done, Henry assured him. Though I expect I'll have curious customers tomorrow, once word gets around. Will that bother you? Henry shook his head. Been running that shop for 40 years. Takes more than a little attention to rattle me. As the driver held the door, Henry turned to Michael one last time. Thank you for tonight, for remembering an old man who taught you something so long ago. Thank you for the lessons, Michael replied sincerely. Not just about driving, but about life. About seeing what's ahead, not just what's right in front of you. They shook hands, and Henry climbed into the car. As the vehicle pulled away, Michael stood watching until its taillights disappeared around a corner. Tomorrow, he would visit the garage again. Tomorrow, he would tell Henry about the foundation program he was establishing in his name. Tomorrow, they would talk more about those long-ago lessons and the paths their lives had taken since. But tonight, Michael felt a sense of completion, a circle closed, a debt of gratitude finally acknowledged. As he walked to his own car, Michael thought about all the coaches and teachers who had shaped his journey. Dean Smith, Phil Jackson, his high school coach, all rightfully recognized for their contributions to his career. But there had been others too. The less obvious influences. His father, of course, whose work ethic and quiet strength had been his foundation. His mother, whose unwavering support had given him confidence. And Henry Wilson, a driver's education teacher who had, in just a few weeks of classes, planted seeds of wisdom that had grown throughout Michael's life. The next morning, Michael arrived at Wilson's Auto Repair just as Henry was unlocking the front door. The old mechanic didn't seem surprised to see him. Right on time, Henry observed, pushing the door open. Coffee's not ready yet. I brought some, Michael replied, holding up a carrier with 2 cups. Figured I owed you after all your hospitality. They settled into Henry's small office, the morning sun streaming through the dusty windows. On the wall, Michael noticed an empty space where the Laney High driver's education photo had hung. Took it down? He asked, gesturing to the space. Henry nodded. Seemed right to give it to you. It's in that folder on the desk, along with a few other things I thought you might want. Michael picked up the folder and opened it. Inside was the class photo, a few newspaper clippings about Laney High's basketball team from the late 70s, and something else, a handwritten letter. What's this? Michael asked, picking up the folded paper. Something I wrote after you won your first championship with the Bulls, Henry explained, looking slightly embarrassed. Never sent it. Didn't seem my place to reach out after all those years. Michael unfolded the letter carefully, aware that he was holding a piece of history. Not basketball history, but personal history. A connection to a past he had almost forgotten. Addictoid, he began to read Henry's neat, precise handwriting. Michael felt a rush of emotion. The letter was simple, congratulatory, but with a final line that now seemed prophetic. You've always known how to see far down the road, Michael. That's what makes you different. That's what makes you great. Michael looked up from the letter to find Henry watching him, eyes clear and bright despite his age. Thank you, Michael said simply, knowing no other words were necessary between them. Henry nodded, understanding in his gaze. Sometimes the most important connections in our lives are the ones we least expect. Henry nodded, understanding in his gaze. Sometimes the most important connections in our lives are the ones we least expect. 6 months later, Michael stood before a small crowd gathered in the newly renovated Wilson's Auto Repair and Education Center. The old garage had been transformed. Modern equipment now stood alongside the classic tools Henry had used for decades. The building had been expanded to include a classroom space where local youth could learn automotive skills. Henry stood beside Michael, looking slightly uncomfortable in the new navy blue coveralls with the shop's new logo embroidered on the U chest. But there was pride in his eyes as he surveyed what his modest garage had become. "This is just the beginning," Michael addressed the gathered crowd of reporters, community members, and the first class of students enrolled in the program. The Henry Wilson Automotive Education Foundation will be opening similar centers across the country, focusing on underserved communities where practical skills training can open doors to careers and self-sufficiency. Michael glanced at Henry, who gave a small nod of approval. They had spent hours discussing the foundation's mission, with Henry insisting that it focus not just on automotive skills, but on the life lessons that came with them: responsibility, foresight, problem-solving, and persistence. "Mr. Wilson taught me more than how to drive a car," Michael continued. "He taught me principles that shaped my approach to basketball and to life. Now, through this program, he'll be able to share that wisdom with a new generation." After the formal ribbon-cutting ceremony, as the crowd mingled and toured the facility, Michael pulled Henry aside. "Still think it's too much?" Michael asked, knowing Henry's modest nature had initially made him resistant to having his name on the foundation. "It's growing on me," Henry admitted, "especially after meeting these kids. They remind me of my students back in the day, looking for someone to believe in them, to teach them something useful." He smiled. "Reminds me why I started teaching in the first place." They walked through the shop, where several teenagers were already learning to change oil under the supervision of experienced mechanics hired by the foundation. "How's the new apartment?" Michael asked. After some persuasion, Henry had agreed to move into a comfortable apartment above the shop. At 84, climbing the stairs was becoming difficult, but Henry had refused to retire completely. "Just slowing down a bit," he'd insisted. "Suits me fine," Henry replied. "Nice to have the short commute. And the elevator helps these old knees." They paused by a wall where photographs chronicled the history of Wilson's Auto Repair. The centerpiece was a newly framed newspaper article about their reunion, headlined "NBA Legend Reconnects with Teacher Who Saw His Potential." Beside it hung a shadow box containing the driver's education log, with Henry's prophetic notes about Michael's focus and potential. "Still can't believe you kept that all these years," Michael remarked. "Kept records on all my students," Henry reminded him. "Though I admit, started paying more attention to yours once you made it to the NBA." Michael laughed. "Fair enough." A young girl approached them hesitantly, clipboard in hand. She was one of the first students in the program. Barely 16, but with a serious expression that reminded Michael of himself at that age. "Mr. Wilson?" she asked. "Could you check my diagnostic worksheet? I think I found the problem with the Honda we're working on, but I want to make sure." Henry studied her worksheet with the same careful attention he'd given to every student over his long career. "Good work, Aisha. You identified the primary issue. But what else should you check while you're at it?" The girl thought for a moment. "The connecting systems? To make sure the problem hasn't caused damage elsewhere?" "Exactly," Henry nodded, pleased. "Always look beyond the obvious problem. See the whole picture." As Aisha hurried back to her team, Henry turned to Michael. "That one's got potential. Mind like a steel trap. Reminds me of my best students. Like the skinny kid from Laney High? Michael asked with a smile. He turned out all right, Henry admitted with a twinkle in his eye. Later, as the event wound down, Michael's assistant reminded him of his flight schedule. He needed to leave for the airport soon to make it back to Charlotte for a Hornets game the following day. I'll be back next month for the board meeting, Michael told Henry as they said their goodbyes. Call me if you need anything before then. And remember, your job is to teach and mentor. Let the foundation staff handle the paperwork. Don't worry about me, Henry assured him. Been managing just fine for over 80 years. Michael grinned. That you have. They shook hands. The NBA legend and the elderly mechanic, their lives, now permanently intertwined in a way neither could have predicted. As Michael walked to his waiting car, he glanced back at the garage. Henry stood in the doorway, just as he had that rainy day 6 months ago when Michael's car had broken down. But now Henry wasn't alone. He was surrounded by students, pointing something out on an engine, his hands moving in the same precise, careful way they always had. Some things change, Michael thought. The garage was bigger, better equipped. The sign was newer and brighter. Henry moved a little slower than before, but some things remained the same. The care Henry took with his students, the wisdom in his simple instructions, the way he could see potential where others might miss it. In the car, Michael opened his briefcase and took out the folder Henry had given him that day after the Bulls ceremony. He'd had the letter framed and hung in his home office, but he kept the driver's education log with him when he traveled, a reminder of an important lesson. Sometimes the most valuable teachers aren't the most famous ones. Sometimes they're the ones who simply do their jobs with excellence and integrity, day after day, never seeking recognition. As the car pulled away, Michael's phone buzzed with a message from Janet, his foundation director. The second Wilson Automotive Education Center, this one in Wilmington, North Carolina, had found the perfect location, right next to Laney High School. Michael smiled. The circle was complete. Sometimes, by extraordinary chance, you get the opportunity to say thank you to those who helped you along the way. And sometimes, that thank you becomes something bigger. A legacy that continues to teach new generations the same valuable lessons. Look ahead. See beyond the immediate problem. Prepare for what's coming. Simple wisdom from a driving instructor that had helped shape a basketball legend. And now, through the foundation bearing his name, Henry Wilson's approach to life would continue shaping young minds long into the future. The car turned onto the highway, heading toward the airport and all the commitments awaiting one of the world's most famous athletes. But Michael's thoughts remained with the elderly teacher who had, through a chance reunion, reminded him of where some of his most fundamental principles had originated. Sometimes the most important connections in our lives are indeed the ones we least expect. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so leave a comment below sharing your location and what this story meant to you. For another inspiring story that will move you just as much, click the video appearing on your screen right now. Thanks for listening.